Imagine a moonless night at sea. Hundreds of children packed onto a darkened ship with their teachers, leaving behind the only home they've ever known. They huddle on deck, whispers of fear passing between them. Suddenly, a torpedo's explosion rips through the hull. The ship shudders violently. In an instant, cold black water rushes in and panic screams fill the air. Within minutes, the vessel begins to sink beneath the waves. This is not a scene from a movie. It really happened. The ship was evacuating civilians from Okinawa in the final year of World War II when it was torpedoed, killing almost everyone on board, including hundreds of school children. How did these innocent civilians end up in the crosshairs of war, forced to flee their island home? This is the harrowing story of how Japanese civilians were forced to evacuate Okinawa, a story of fear, survival, heartbreak, and the desperate measures taken as a ferocious battle loomed. It matters even today because it shows how war spares no one and why the lessons of Okinawa should never be forgotten.
To understand why those children were on that doomed ship, we have to go back to Okinawa in 1944. World War II was closing in on Japan's doorstep. Okinawa, a string of islands south of mainland Japan, was about to become the front line. The Japanese military knew the Americans were coming. They planned to make Okinawa the last bulwark, a do-or-die defense of the homeland. But there was a problem. Okinawa was full of civilians, families, farmers, children. Roughly 600,000 people lived on the islands. Many had nowhere else to go. To the military brass in Tokyo, these civilians were not people to protect, but an obstacle. They bluntly saw the elderly, women, and children as a nuisance to their military plans. So Japan's government hastily drew up an evacuation plan, remove as many non-combatants as possible from Okinawa. On paper, the goal was to evacuate about 100,000 Okinawans to safety on the main islands of Japan or to Taiwan. In reality, it would prove far easier said than done.
The plan was announced, and at first glance you might think people would jump at the chance to escape. But picture yourself as an Okinawan villager in 1944. You've lived on this island your entire life. Your ancestors are buried here. You've been told almost nothing about how the war is really going. The government controls the news, and few truly know that Okinawa may soon become a living hell. Suddenly, officials urge you to send your children, your grandparents, and others away on ships, across the sea, to places you've never been. Would you go? Many Okinawans hesitated. The evacuation failed to gain momentum among the local population. There were several reasons. First, people did not grasp the danger coming, kept in the dark about Japan's military situation. Propaganda and censorship painted a rosy picture, so many could not imagine the storm about to hit them. Second, there was deep fear of the journey itself. The ocean was swarming with American submarines by late 1944, and folks knew ships could be sunk en route, a terrifying prospect that made parents think twice. Third, the idea of leaving Okinawa was itself heartbreaking. This was their home, their land. Abandoning it felt almost like a betrayal. And what would await them on the other side? There was anxiety about the uncertainty of life as evacuees. Where would they live? And would they be welcomed or treated as outsiders? These doubts and fears meant that far fewer people evacuated than the government wanted. Out of the 600,000-strong population, only around 80,000 civilians, mostly children and the elderly, actually left Okinawa before the battle. The vast majority stayed put, not fully aware that they were sitting in the path of one of the deadliest battles of the century.
For those who did evacuate, the journey was perilous. Entire schools were sent away.
Parents, choking back tears, put their children on boats bound for the mainland, praying it was the right decision. One 11-year-old boy later recalled how his family embarked on a convoy of ships leaving Okinawa in September 1944. They departed Naha Harbor late in the afternoon under a shroud of secrecy. 10 ships slipped out together in convoy, flanked by Japanese Navy destroyers as escorts. Everyone knew why the Navy ships were there. American submarines prowled the waters. Many submarines were in the ocean near Okinawa, the boy remembered, and many ships were sunk during the voyage. In his convoy, he said, "We were lucky to get there alive." What was normally a quick trip turned into an epic, tense odyssey. To avoid detection, the convoy hid among small islands by day and moved under cover of darkness at night. It normally took a day or two to sail from Okinawa to Taiwan, but his convoy took 10 days of nerve-wracking zigzagging before they finally reached the port of Keelung. Imagine the relief of those families stepping onto land after 10 days of constant fear, having seen ships in front of them blown apart and sunk. They had escaped the coming battle, but their trials were far from over.
Life in evacuation was often harsh. Those who reached safety in mainland Japan found themselves strangers in a strange land. Okinawan evacuees were usually sent to rural villages or school dormitories. There, they encountered a chilly reception from some locals. The Okinawans were culturally distinct. They spoke a different dialect, had different customs, and mainland Japanese society, after years of forced assimilation, had long treated Okinawans as second-class citizens. This prejudice didn't vanish in wartime. An Okinawan child evacuee in Taiwan recalled that when he and his peers were placed into Japanese-run schools, they immediately felt the sting of discrimination from mainland Japanese. The local children came to school neat and well-supplied, wearing smart uniforms with shoes, socks, hats, and proper school bags, while the Okinawan kids were mostly barefoot, with maybe a simple cloth bundle to carry their things. They were looked down on and made to feel other. It was a bitter irony. These families had fled a war zone only to be treated as outsiders by their own countrymen. Worse still, evacuation did not guarantee safety. Okinawan refugees in Taiwan soon found that American bombers came after them there, too. The war was truly worldwide. Nowhere, it seemed, was safe from the reach of violence. In the city of Taichu, Okinawan evacuees, including women and children, were put to work at a sugar mill. Not long after, American heavy bombers and British aircraft began pounding the city with air raids day after day. One survivor described bombs falling from 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening like clockwork. The sugar mill where they worked was hit repeatedly. The evacuees would scramble to whatever shelter they could find as the sky rained explosives. Even little children had to learn the deadly routines of air raids far from home. It was a cruel reminder that in this total war, simply being a civilian offered no protection.
And then there was the tragedy that opened our story, a nightmare that became every Okinawan parent's worst fear. The government had encouraged, even ordered school children to be evacuated by ship to safer areas. In August 1944, one such evacuation convoy left Okinawa shores under cover of darkness. Among the vessels was the Tsushima Maru, a passenger cargo ship filled to the brim with civilian evacuees, about 1,788 people in all, the majority of them elementary school children on a school evacuation program. They sailed north toward the Japanese mainland, hoping to reach Kagoshima. But on the night of August 22, 1944, as the convoy glided through the darkness, an American submarine spotted it and fired its torpedoes. The Tsushima Maru was struck. The horrifying scene we imagined earlier then unfolded in real life. The ship sank into the Black Sea. Out of those nearly 1,800 aboard, only 254 people survived the sinking. That means about 1,534 innocents died in one night, including around 780 children. 780 children.
Nearly an entire generation of Okinawan kids from that convoy gone. It was a loss so staggering and so painful that the authorities immediately hushed it up. A strict gag order was imposed. Survivors and families were forbidden from speaking publicly about the sinking. Many parents on Okinawa never even learned what happened to their evacuated children until long after the war. The ocean had swallowed their sons and daughters, and the truth was drowned by military secrecy.
Stories like the Tsushima Maru spread quiet terror among those who knew. Some Okinawans who had considered evacuating decided to stay, not trusting that the voyage was any safer than the battle to come. And come it did. On April 1st, 1945, the United States military launched a massive invasion of Okinawa, the start of an 82-day hell on Earth. The Imperial Japanese Army had dug in, ready for a fight to the death. Tragically, most Okinawan civilians were still on the island when the battle began. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children caught in the middle of a titanic clash. What followed was aptly nicknamed a typhoon of steel. The Americans threw tens of thousands of troops, fleets of ships, and endless bombardments into capturing Okinawa. The Japanese defenders, deeply entrenched, fought fiercely and often suicidally. Caught in this crossfire were the Okinawan people, whose beautiful, lush island was transformed into a burning, bombed-out wasteland. The battle raged from April into June, nearly 3 months of slaughter. It became the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, and Okinawan civilians paid the highest price. By the end, as many as 100,000, perhaps up to 150,000 Okinawan civilians were dead. Families were wiped out, villages literally obliterated. Those who had feared leaving Okinawa now faced an even worse fate by staying. Each day was a struggle to simply stay alive amid constant artillery barrages, airstrikes, and gunfire. One survivor described it as a hell on earth. Dead bodies, crying and screaming people, total chaos everywhere. Another remembered hiding in a cave with his mother and grandmother, with no food or water while bullets and shrapnel pelted the island outside. Survival often came down to sheer luck. A piece of shrapnel flies one way instead of another. A soldier decides not to throw a grenade into your shelter, or does. What's worse, the civilians faced threats not just from the sky and sea, but from both armies around them. Japanese soldiers, despite ostensibly defending Okinawa, often treated the local people with suspicion and cruelty. By battle's end, even Okinawa's own memorial accounts would conclude that the Imperial Japanese Army had shown indifference to Okinawan safety and had inflicted atrocities upon them. Japanese troops used civilians as human shields, deliberately stationing themselves among women and children to deter American fire. They forced countless civilians out of whatever shelters they had, even at gunpoint, because the army wanted the caves and bunkers for themselves. If Okinawan families hid food to survive, soldiers often confiscated it for the military and executed anyone who resisted or hid supplies, condemning many to starvation. There were even instances of people being killed for speaking their own Okinawan dialect, paranoid troops fearing spies or traitors. For Okinawans, danger came from all sides. On the American side, troops at first could hardly tell civilians from combatants. A 10-year-old girl or an old farmer could be a harmless refugee, or they could be armed or carrying a grenade for the Japanese army. Amid such confusion, some units fired indiscriminately at any village or home, unsure if enemy soldiers were hiding there. Okinawan civilians were truly trapped between a rock and a hard place, between two armies, neither of which fully valued their lives. Perhaps the most tragic chapter was what happened to Okinawan spirit under this unimaginable pressure. Propaganda had long told the locals that surrender was not an option. They were fed horrific tales that American soldiers were monsters who would torture, rape, and kill anyone they captured. Many believed it. So as defeat loomed for the Japanese military, they gave ghastly instructions. Civilians were encouraged to commit suicide rather than be captured. Parents were told it would be better to kill their own children and themselves than fall into American hands. In caves and hamlets across Okinawa, this nightmare became reality. Thousands of civilians took their own lives or killed their families in despair, sometimes using hand grenades given to them for that very purpose. Mothers drowned their babies, fathers hanged themselves, whole families jumped from cliffs together. It is almost too painful to imagine, yet it happened again and again in those final weeks of the battle. One of the most haunting places in Okinawa today is near the cliffs where, in June 1945, scores of families leapt to their deaths. They had been convinced that this was somehow more honorable, more safe, than what the enemy would do to them if they survived. Later, survivors would bitterly recall how indoctrination and propaganda had driven these mass suicides. In a dark twist, some who lived through it reflected that Okinawans had been taught to be more Japanese than the Japanese, utterly loyal and willing to die, and in the end, they died because of that indoctrination.
And yet, even amidst this horror, there were glimmers of humanity and courage. A few Japanese soldiers, disobeying fanatic orders from above, tried to save civilians. One Okinawan woman, hiding in a cave, was shocked when a Japanese officer disguised himself in a civilian's kimono and urged her and others to surrender to the Americans. He gently insisted that the stories about American brutality were false and that surrender was their only hope to live. Summoning incredible courage, that officer led a small group of civilians out to the American lines, effectively saving their lives. On the American side, there were also acts of compassion. As GIs realized the civilian plight, many tried to coax Okinawans out of danger, sometimes carrying children to safety or sharing rations with starving locals. Interpreters broadcast assurances in Japanese and in Okinawan dialect, pleading with civilians to come out of hiding and surrender peacefully. Time and again, Okinawans who expected to be killed by the Americans were instead given food, water, and medical care, experiences that left many survivors surprised at the relative mercy shown by the former enemy. These small mercies did not undo the colossal tragedy, but they shone as beacons of hope in an otherwise hellish landscape. By June 1945, the battle finally ended. Okinawa was devastated beyond imagination. The landscape was unrecognizable, towns and farms blasted to craters, nearly every family mourning lost loved ones. The Japanese defenders were annihilated. The Americans had paid a terrible price as well, with over 12,000 killed. But in that tally, nothing compares to the civilian loss. Roughly 1/3 of Okinawa's pre-war population was wiped out in a matter of weeks. Those 80,000 who had evacuated earlier now anxiously waited to know if they even had homes or relatives left. Some would never return. Their home was now a graveyard. Those who did return found a vastly changed world. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Okinawa came under United States military occupation. The island remained under American administration for decades and did not return to Japanese control until 1972. For the civilians, the war's end brought relief that the killing stopped, but also a new struggle under occupation and the long task of rebuilding life from ashes.
Why is this story important today? Because the tragedy of Okinawa's civilians stands as one of the clearest warnings of what happens when war utterly disregards the lives of ordinary people. It is a reminder that behind every military strategy and every famous battle, there are real families and children who bear the brunt. Okinawa teaches us about the cost of imperial hubris and extreme ideology, how a government's pride and lies can lead to its own people suffering. The leadership's failure to evacuate more people in time, the willingness to sacrifice Okinawan lives as a delaying tactic, and the indoctrination of civilians all magnified the catastrophe. Could more lives have been saved if things had been done differently? Almost certainly yes. Not only was the evacuation slow and incomplete, it was sabotaged by poor communication and by chilling cover-ups of tragedies like the ship sinking, not to mention the needless brutality that drove civilians to hopeless choices. The legacy of Okinawa's evacuation and battle still echoes. To this day, Okinawans carry the memory of that trauma, passed down through generations. Every year, memorial services are held, and the names of all who died are read aloud, one by one, an island-wide act of mourning and remembrance. Many survivors, now elderly, have shared their testimonies so that younger generations understand the horror of war. In Japan as a whole, Okinawa forced a reckoning with how civilians are protected or not in wartime. In the 21st century, planners have even discussed how civilians might be evacuated from Okinawa again in case of a future conflict, for example, if a war over nearby Taiwan were to erupt. It is sobering to think that 8 decades after World War II, we are once again talking about potentially evacuating over 100,000 people from Okinawa's outer islands in the face of another possible war. The dilemmas faced in 1944 are not just dusty history. They remain relevant whenever and wherever civilians are caught between armies. In the end, the story of Japanese civilians forced to evacuate Okinawa is a heart-wrenching chapter of history that must not be forgotten. It is a story of ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary nightmare. Some escaped only to face hardship and loss far from home. Others stayed and endured one of the most brutal battles ever fought, with terrifying choices at every turn. For the viewer hearing this tale, there is a lesson in every scene. The mother pushing her crying child up the gangplank of an evacuation ship, the frightened boy crouching under a rock as planes strafe a foreign land, the old farmer clinging to his cane as he trudges into the mountains to flee the bombardment, the young soldier who decides mercy is more important than orders. Each of these moments teaches us something about courage, fear, and humanity. And above all, Okinawa's saga teaches us the value of peace. One survivor, reflecting on it all, said simply, "I believe that wars must never happen again." After hearing what these civilians went through, the ones who left, the ones who stayed, the ones who lived, and the far too many who died, we can understand why. The next time someone wonders why we must strive so hard to avoid war, remember the people of Okinawa. Remember the little girl on that darkened ship and the tens of thousands who never made it to safety. Their story is the price of war paid in innocent lives, and it is a price we never want to pay again. This is why Okinawa matters, and why the voices of its civilians still call out to us, urging us to learn from the past so that no other children are ever forced to live through such a nightmare.